Hello, my name's John Considine. I teach English at the University of Alberta in Canada. This is the second of 3 broadcasts which I'm making about syntax. These broadcasts are particularly intended for the use of my students in English 212, Introduction to the English Language, at the University of Alberta. If you haven't heard the first broadcast, I'd advise you to go back and hear it. In that broadcast, I talked about what syntax is, the art of putting words and larger constituents, such as phrases and clauses, together into sentences. What I want to talk about in this broadcast is how we understand what's going on when syntax happens, how we can describe the processes which underlie the syntax of the sentences which we, as speakers of English, utter. One way of describing what's going on would be to look at as many examples of real English sentences as we possibly could. We could take a corpus, a collection of English utterances. The biggest of these are now very big. We could perhaps get 1 billion words of English together, and we could find out the patterns in which they can be deployed and the patterns in which they can't. We'd end up being able to say that certain ways of putting sentences together are clearly well recognized and productive in English, that others are rarer and odder, that some can't happen at all. That sort of descriptive syntax has certainly been undertaken for English and for a number of other languages. In the 1950s, the American linguist and public intellectual Noam Chomsky approached syntax in rather a different way. And it's hardly an exaggeration to say that all of linguistics has been following up on his ideas since. That is an exaggeration, but it's not a very grave one. Chomsky had some big questions to ask. One of them, to which we'll return later in this course, was how it is that humans know languages. How is it that babies, who are exposed to rather ragged, unsystematic linguistic input, end up speaking languages so well? Look at me. Nobody ever taught me English. My parents talked English around me, and somehow they talked English to me. And somehow I ended up as a fluent speaker of English. I ended up mastering an awful lot of very, very complicated rules. However, did I do that? Chomsky's approach to that question is something that we'll be coming back to right at the end of term. But Chomsky has another big question as well, and it's closely related to the question, how is it that we acquire language? Chomsky asks, what is language when we acquire it? What is the sort of linguistic competence? A concept not unrelated to Saussure's Langue. What is the linguistic competence which speakers of a language have? A way in which Chomsky formulated that question was what rules might generate all the correct sentences of a given language, such as English, and only those correct sentences. A rule which said you can put any words in any order you want would generate all the correct sentences of English, but it would also generate a lot of sentences which weren't correct. It would generate the sentence, "The cat sits on the book," but it would also generate the sentence, "Cat the book the on sits." We need a set of rules which generate all and only the correct sentences, the grammatical sentences of English. That idea of correctness and grammaticality is one to which we'll return in our third broadcast. But for now, we ought to look at some of the rules which have been proposed as generating grammatical sentences in English. On page 171 of Curzon and Adams's textbook, we're given some phrase structure rules, some of the rules which do seem to generate grammatical sentences. They'll actually be quite familiar to us at one level, from the way that we were thinking about the lexical categories of English words last week. We saw then that one of the ways that you can spot a noun is that it's often preceded by a determiner. If you've got a phrase like the aardvark, even if you don't know what an aardvark is, you can guess that aardvark is a noun because it's got the before it. If you have a form like the ferocious, bloodthirsty, psychotic aardvark, you can still say aardvark is clearly a noun. And you can say, I know it's a noun because it's preceded by a determiner and a series of adjectives. Another way of saying that would be to say that there's a phrase structure rule which says that a noun phrase can consist of a noun preceded by a determiner. And there's a phrase structure rule which says that a noun phrase can consist of a noun preceded by, in this order, a determiner and one or more optional adjectives. If you try putting together a whole set of phrase structure rules like that, you can get a long way. You can end up with rules which do generate an awful lot of well-formed sentences in English, and which don't generate some of the conceivable ill-formed sentences in English. What you could do after that is something which makes Chapter 6 of Curzon and Adams's textbook typographically distinctive. Even if you've just leafed through that chapter without reading it carefully, and I did tell you, dear students, some of this material is highly complex. If you get stuck, leaf through it without reading it carefully. If you did that, you'll have seen a number of diagrams which look a bit like family trees. Those are called phrase structure trees, and they're diagrams which represent phrase structure rules working out, explaining the structure of sentences. So these are those diagrams which start on page 174. What they do is really to map the constituents of sentences. They show how the words which make up a particular phrase or clause hang together. If you were mapping a highly recursive sentence with those phrase structure trees, they'd show how one sentence is embedded in another, and maybe how that other sentence is embedded in a third. Making phrase structure trees is a delightful pastime, and we're not going to do it. We've only got 14 weeks for this course. We could spend weeks and weeks and weeks happily making phrase structure trees. We're not going to. If we did that, something we'd find out, as we see on page 175 of Curzon and Adams, is that the phrase structure tree for a given unambiguous sentence can be mapped, can be drawn, in more ways than one. We'd find that sometimes drawing phrase structure trees helps us to articulate why it is that an ambiguous sentence is ambiguous, but we would also find that sometimes there's disagreement as to how a phrase structure tree can articulate the structure of a sentence. That sort of disagreement, that sort of uncertainty, is familiar to us already, isn't it? When we were thinking about the morphological analysis of English words, we were thinking about the way that analysing some words morphologically is actually a bit tricky. You remember cases like cranberry, where you've got a word which seems to have one morpheme, berry, realised in it, but then it also has the element cran, and cran doesn't seem to mean anything, so it can't realise a morpheme, because morphemes are units of meaning. You have a problem there, a problem for linguistic analysis. When you can do two different phrase structure trees to express the underlying structure of one unambiguous sentence, you've got a problem for linguistic analysis again. And as I said when we were talking about morphology, it's these problems which make linguistics worth doing. If linguistics had all been done, if all the answers had been arrived at, then, well, linguists would be out of jobs and they could go and do something different, but a field of human inquiry would be closed down. That field hasn't been closed down. It's not going to be in a hurry. There's a further set of problems. Some constructions can't be mapped with a nice hierarchical tree. For those constructions, we need another set of rules, which accounts for the way that the elements which any hierarchical phrase structure tree would put in one place in a sentence actually turn up in another place. Curzon and Adams give an example of one of these cases at pages 180 to 181. The sentence that they give as an example is, "I diagrammed the sentence that the teacher provided." Now that's obviously a well-formed sentence, as long as you don't object to the use of diagram as a verb, as why should you? It's obviously a well-formed sentence. But phrase structure trees are bound to put the that in the last verb phrase in the sentence. There's no way that a nice, neat, hierarchical phrase structure tree can get that, I diagrammed the sentence, that the teacher provided, from after provided to before the teacher. We need a so-called transformational rule to move that word from the position that we'd expect if we were playing phrase structure trees by the book, to the position that it actually occurs in real English, introducing the relative clause. Once we start making transformational rules, as well as simple, straightforward, generative phrase structure rules, we're trying to put together a transformational generative grammar of English. And at this point, our topic becomes really, really complicated, much too complicated for me, much too complicated for anyone but the professional syntacticians, who have all sorts of elaborate theories about what sort of set of algorithms might generate all and only the correct sentences of English. None of those theories has actually worked comprehensively yet. In practice, the ideal of a transformational generative grammar of English, which would give us rules to generate all and only the grammatical sentences of English, hasn't been realised. And perhaps that's just not quite how our brains work. I remember when I was a student, an undergraduate, being very impressed by a lecture which was an overt attack on Chomsky. And it was an overt attack on the idea that you can have algorithms which will generate all and only the correct sentences of a natural language. The lecturer said, I'm not sure if he was being fair, but it was memorable, that Chomsky teaches at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and that the big subject on the curriculum there is computing, and that the problem with transformational generative grammar is that it treats human brains like computers. It says put the algorithm in and the output will come out. Maybe that isn't quite how our brains work, and towards the end of chapter 6, Curzon and Adams explain that there are other ways of looking at the way that humans do syntax. I think certainly something that they say that we can't overlook is that very small humans, it's so often babies who help us to understand what we're doing when we do language. Very small humans will pick up whole phrases or whole clauses, not just single words, and they'll use those in conversation, or they'll utter those. So, for instance, a colleague of mine, when she was very small and hadn't really spoken a single word, was sitting in the car being driven about by her mother, who said to her, in German, "Es ist kalt, Sylvie." That's the German for "it is cold, Sylvie." And baby Sylvie replied, "Und windig auch." And windy too. That's 3 words. Was baby Sylvie putting those 3 words together when she had never spoken a word by itself? Or was it just that she had picked up this response to "es ist kalt" as a sort of whole unit? If the latter is the case, and I'm sure it is, what does that say about the way that we do syntax, about the way that we put words together? To what extent is learning set phrases part of learning how to put words together? And how different is that learning of set phrases and modelling other phrases on them from having a Chomskyan algorithm based on phrase structure rules, generative rules, transformational rules? These are big questions. They're questions which are tied up with the question that Curzon and Adams ask us right at the end of the chapter: does generative grammar succeed? And one way of answering that question is certainly to say yes. It may not do all of the things that it set out to, but it forces us to think critically about how our brains work when we're doing language. It forces us, in fact, to ask some very big, difficult questions about how our brains work when we're doing language. And anything that forces us to ask big, difficult questions surely is, at an intellectual level, successful. In my 3rd broadcast, I want to come back to the questions about correctness and grammaticality, to which I said earlier in this one we would return, and I'd also like to think about 1 or 2 particular cases where the grammaticality or ungrammaticality of syntactic units can be judged, can be discussed in English. Thanks very much.